Welcome, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture in the flagship Frankie lecture series on titled Mapping as Knowing. This is a new initiative that we are debuting this academic year and have planned a series of exciting lectures that interrogate what mapping means today and what it has meant historically and across disciplines. First of all, I would like to thank several faculty across departments at Yale who came together last year to help us flesh out this vision for this series. I would like to thank Bill Rankin from History of Science, Aisha Ramachandran from Comparative Literature, Laura Barraclough from American Studies, Raymond Clements from the Beinecke Library, Ronald Smith from Geology and Geophysics, and Rick Prum from Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. As you can see, this is giving you a flavor of the kinds of disciplines that are going to engage in our series. Before briefly talking about the raison d'etre for this series, I would like to acknowledge the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke, who are in the audience. Thank you very much for your gift that has made all of this possible. So in my own field, astronomy, for instance, mapping has been the principal way of knowing. And maps of the sky over time have encoded the state of our knowledge, our conception of cosmos. In fact, we are now at a stage when we have successfully indirectly mapped invisible entities in the universe. In other fields, mapping has often provided key insights into complex collective phenomena, be it disparities in income across geographies, voting patterns, spread of diseases, and visually epistemic relationships between phenomena that are helping us disentangle correlation from causation. Maps remain deeply meaningful even as what they encode is rapidly evolving. As part of this series, we will be hearing from distinguished speakers about mapping various intellectual terrains and what mapping has provided us in terms of construction of new knowledge across fields. Mapping the scientific process itself, which is our next talk by Felice Frenkel, will be in October. Mapping what computers have taught us will be our talk in November from Jack Hidari, who heads Google X. Mapping the genome, mapping the brain, mapping languages, and so on and so forth. So we have an entire year of monthly exciting talks. Also, we are required to give you this notice. This event is being recorded and photographed for educational archival purposes, and including use in print and on the internet and other forms of media. By attending this event today, you agree to the possibility of your voice or your likeness being captured by these means and used for such purposes without compensation to you, and hereby waive any related right of privacy or publicity. And there will be a reception in room 108 immediately following the event, and we warmly invite all of you to come and continue the conversation downstairs. We have an absolutely fantastic speaker, very distinguished scholar and cartographer, Professor Matthew Edney, as our inaugural speaker this evening. I would now like to invite Bill Rankin, Associate Professor of History of Science, whose own work has focused on cartography, navigation, and relationship to territory, to introduce Professor Edney. Bill?
Thank you, Priya. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Matthew Edney. Matthew is one of the world's leading scholars on the history of maps, mapping, and cartography. He has particular expertise in the 18th and 19th century, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he's one of the few people who can speak with some real authority about nearly any aspect of map history, especially in the West. So I'll introduce Matthew here in two different ways. First, the official biographical introduction, and then briefly kind of my own personal reflection on his work. So institutionally, Matthew wears two main hats. He was trained as a geographer, studied under one of the major historians of mapping of a previous generation, and now he's professor of geography and Osher Professor of the History of Cartography at the University of Southern Maine. The Osher in his named chair is connected with the Osher Map Library, a major map collection that first brought Matthew to Maine in 1995, and where he's been installed as faculty scholar ever since. He has helped the library to grow exponentially, both in its physical and digital incarnation. Since 2005, he's also held a position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he directs the Monumental History of Cartography project, a multi-decade NSF-funded collaboration to provoke research and writing from scholars around the world working on maps and mapping. I hear that he is just now finishing editing about 1 million words on cartography during the European Enlightenment, which will be appearing next year from the University of Chicago Press. Matthew's own scholarship has ranged widely, both within the book-centric humanities and the more article-centric realm of geography. His first book, Mapping an Empire, The Geographic Construction of British India, 1765 to 1843, traced the history of British attempts to map the Indian subcontinent, mostly, as he shows, without the success they had hoped for. His forthcoming book, which we'll be hearing a bit more about today, is Cartography, The Ideal and Its History, which I won't spoil now with any further comments. He's also published many influential articles on everything from the early mapping of New England to theoretical perspectives on the nature of mapping to deep dives into the history of the field. Now, taking this all together, I'd say that Matthew's work has been influential for me ever since I came across it early in graduate school. And the overarching thread that I see connecting all the various research and the quality that has made his work so helpful, even for someone like me working on the 20th century, is that Matthew shows convincingly that mapping is not one big thing. It's not something we can talk about in any monolithic way. Mapping is many different things. It always has been and always will be. And we should certainly not take map makers themselves at their word when they claim to know what mapping is or how it works. And actually, now having shared a room with Matthew on several occasions here, I would say that what makes these kinds of broad insights possible is really a dual interest that he has, both in broad theoretical statements and a kind of deep empirical devotion to the history of maps and mapping over several hundred years on at least 3 continents. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Edney.
Thank you. Okay. Right. Thank you. Sorry, I just only realized that I have hidden my clock over here. But there's a clock right there in front of me. So I need to start worrying at about 4:40. Okay. Okay, so firstly, thank you very much to Priya and to Bill for A, arranging the lecture series and B, inviting me. Very pleased to be here at Yale. Here we go. So as Bill said, I am, among my sins, director of the History of Cartography project at University of Wisconsin. We have 6 volumes covering all periods, all times. Volumes 1, 2, and 3. You can see a certain trend of growth here for reasons that I can't get into today. All published through 2007. Volume 6 published on the 20th century out of sequence in 2015. And then we've got 4 and 5. Volume 4 on the 18th century is halfway through copy editing right now. It's been divided up into 6 batches. Batch 4, the letter M, is 526 pages typescript by itself. And that's the next one we're going to get back from the copy editors, so it'll be interesting to see what they do. That was a slog to get through, M's. Volume 5 in the 19th century is about 93-95% submitted, and it's about 40% edited at this point. And so hopefully, knocking on wood, we will have that out in 2023. 4 should come out late in 2023 for volume 5. Again, assuming funding, which is always the big question. One of my particular triumphs, I managed to persuade the University of Chicago Press to put all existing volumes and then the future volumes of the commitment online for free public access. Volumes 1, 2, and 3 went online in 2011, 2012, and volume 6 went online as of July 1 of this year. So far, I collect 6 monthly metrics up through June of 2018. We've had over 3 million chapter downloads of volumes 1 through 3. a statistic that appears very prominently in every single grant application that I do. Right. Now, much of the material in today's talk is actually drawn from the book that Bill was just talking about, Cartography, the Ideal and Its History. It will have a 2019 date. It might appear as early as December, perfect for your Christmas stockings, but probably will appear in January or February. I just learned today that this image will be the cover image of the book. I was hoping to show you the cover itself, but it's still winding its way through approvals at the press. And much of what I'm saying today, I've actually also written up in various other forms at a website that I developed, largely thanks to Bill's inspiration. Bill can do it, I can do it. I can't do anything nearly as good as Bill does on his site. So mappingasprocess.net, which is where I'm trying to work out some ideas leading up to 2 or 3 books down the line. I've got big ideas, big plans. So, as Priya said, this is the inaugural lecture in the Frankie program of Mapping as Knowing. My task today is really basically to think about this concept. What do we mean by mapping? And what does mapping actually entail? I'm not going to speak very much about the various other topics that are going to be addressed in this series. I just want to talk about mapping from the point of view of an interdisciplinary map historian. What are the foundations of this concept of mapping, and what are the hidden implications of it? So, having passed through the puffery, this presentation therefore comprises a review of the common literal and the figurative understandings of mapping, 2 case studies which suggest, both of them in different ways, that we can push mapping too far. And both of these case studies suggest directions for analysis. And then finally, a bit more about what I mean as mapping, stemming from these 2 case studies. So let's get down to business. Literally, mapping is taken generally to mean the act of making maps, of turning the world to paper, or nowadays to digital screens. This process was emblematized on the title page to Adam Friedrich Zerner's Atlas of the Electorate of Saxony, made sometime before 1742. The great thing about this image, and this is going to be the dust jacket image to part 2 of volume 4 of the History of Cartography when it's published. It has these 4 vignettes. I'm ignoring the atlas figure in the middle. That's a different set of cellular fish. That together, these 4 vignettes talk about the observation and measurement and compilation of the results of those observations into maps. And they seem to very nicely define this process of mapping in a sort of a naive kind of way. So in the upper left vignette, we have a stereotypical act of survey, of guided observation from a lofty vantage point. Here he is on top of a hill. Zerner is almost certainly the guy in the blue frock coat. He's looking through a circumferenter, which is a compass with open alidade sights, and he's taking bearings to various places. Just down the hill is his assistant, recording the observations in the notebook. But this is not a strictly algorithmic process, in that Zerner's work is being guided by these 2 figures, unidentified, but probably locals of some kind of standing, who are pointing out the points of interest, the places of interest, the things that Zerner, as a surveyor from away, needs to know about in order to observe them. And of course, in the foreground, we have the staff of servants holding the horses. Now, the situation is a bit more complex. This is actually part of the process of filling in details. It's not part of the overall control process. The control process is a very interesting 18th century German technique where you go up and you have little paper discs and you put them on a plate and then you draw lines to all of your other observation stations. And strictly a graphic process, at about 1,000 stations, Zerner drew 2,000 of these paper circles. And then, back in the office, now we're in the top right vignette, there's Zerner on the far right, directing this guy to arrange these paper circles. Notice he's got a ruler next to him. That's going to be defining the scale. Here's a bit more detail. So this is a process. It's fairly low precision. It's not trigonometrical. It's not the high science. It's a very graphic, pragmatic process. But nonetheless, it's creating a control network of triangulation that's then going to serve as the basis within which you can then do all the detailed observation. The details either come from the work of the circumferencer on top of the hill, or by measuring itineraries, route distances. So here in the foreground, we've got a guy with a perambulator. Has a counter that counts the number of times the wheel rotates, so you can move it down paths and so on. Next to him is a guy holding a chain, a very common measurement tool for smaller distances. And for the roads, Zerner equipped a carriage. You can see a sort of a black rod here that goes from a counter, he's a mechanism on the wheel, and it connects to a counter in the cab. And so Zerner can barrel down the roads at whatever high speed you can get on those roads of those days, measuring distances as he goes. You take all this information and you put them all together here in the last vignette, the lower left vignette, and you can see Zerner again directing the compilation of all these measurements within this controlled network to make the final map. Here's just one of the many maps in this particular atlas. This is of the Kreis of Leipzig, the circle of Leipzig, with a very detailed index of place names on the side, all nicely indexed into the work. Here is a particular detail of the county of Leipzig, and you can see that there are some roads on there, different kinds of towns, and all detailed knowledge. It's phenomenal work. The Staatsbibliothek in Dresden has this all online, so you can observe it to your heart's content. Also, some other strategies for mapping. In this case, an unfinished table of distances across the electorate. So, this is the literal meaning of mapping. Making a map. Controlled systems of measurement producing a selectively reduced image that captures the structural essence of the world. For Chris Board, British map maker, maps are concentrations of the real world in model form. My favorite sort of summary definition of a map, maps are depleted homologues of the world. I mean, that really captures the sense of somehow having been reduced, yet at the same time reproducing the world. In these kinds of approaches, maps allow us to see the world, to think about the world, to make visible what is invisible, to see new arrangements and connections, to see new routes, to see new pathways that can be followed, to interpolate new data, to enable new actions, to create new insights. And in this respect, mapping has stood for the best part of the 20th century as a recurring metaphor for science and maps as scientific theories, whether we're talking about Stephen Toulmin, Michael Polanyi, or whoever. As Christian Jacob says, maps suggest ways of thinking as well as ways of seeing. You know, these are really powerful things, powerful images. From this basic sort of pragmatic standpoint, we go from the literal to the figurative. Figurative mapping is essentially when you take a phenomenon and you treat it as if it was the world. You treat it, you represent it as if you're making a two-dimensional construct of some sort. We bring not the world to paper, but some phenomenon to paper, whether it's DNA, some kind of future action, or as here, relationships. This is a gallant geography, as Charlie Withers calls it, the famous carte de tendre by Madeleine de Scudéry, where she's mapping out the different kinds of affection and social relationship. Sometimes called the map of love, is not. It's a map of social interactions and the different ways different people can interact. A more recent example, actually made to look like a world map, is this, what date is 2013 map of the internet. It's even drawn on a map projection, the same map projection that National Geographic Society uses nowadays. It has a scale and even a numeric ratio, representative fraction. I'm not quite sure what the units are, though, on either side of that ratio. The metaphor works because we know what mapping is. We know what map making is. This process I've just described is not new. I mean, people have been making maps this kind of way going way back when. Control networks change, the techniques change, but the basic practice of looking at landscape, reproducing it on paper, has been very old. But is that actually what mapping is about? And so as I've suggested, let's look at two maps that start to problematize this very entrenched understanding of mapping as cartography. So let's start with Mark Twain's map of the fortifications of Paris, about which I am absolutely obsessed. I really wanted this, not this map, the next map, to be the cover of the book, but press wouldn't have it. They like the Globe instead. So this is the New York Times, New York Tribune from 13th of September 1870. If you don't know the history, basically France declares war on Prussia in July of 1870. By mid-August, the Prussians were besieging the main French army in Metz. By the 2nd of September, on the 2nd of September, they defeated the Second French Army at Sedan, capturing Emperor Louis Napoleon. And by mid-September, they're advancing on Paris. And everybody's expecting Paris to be besieged, and of course it is, and it leads to the Commune and everything else, and Les Mis. But in the meantime, these maps appear this kind of map appears in New York newspapers, other newspapers in the country, and it's a map of Paris, and it's surrounded by this dead straight line of fortifications that are clearly meaningless. It's just like a graphic. Oh, there's fortifications. So Mark Twain, then a newspaperman, thought he would satirize it. First things first, Twain was a wordsmith. He was not a graphic artist, and even though he worked in the press, he actually cut the woodblock for this himself, but he cut it right reading, so when it printed wrong reading, which he then used to his advantage. Now, in this, Twain used standard cartographic conventions. He has double lines for rivers. He has crenulated shapes for forts, little squares for places, and a little building for a house. I mean, these are all fairly standard kind of conventions. But of course, he also played with these conventions. Here's the town of Podunk, which by the 1840s, there's the town of Podunk, which by the 1840s has already become the metaphor for places that are so small and so insignificant, it's actually around here somewhere, that they should never appear on a map. They're not worthy of appearing on maps. Yet here is Podunk. And he also plays with scale. So in addition to having all of Paris, you've got an individual fence line, which Twain is going to write about as being the linchpin of Parisian defenses against the Prussians. And of course, Twain purposefully mixed up the geography. Paris is at the confluence of not only the Seine, but the Rhine and the Erie Canal. Paris and Verdun are joined by Omaha, St. Cloud, Jersey City. Down in here is French town of Vincennes. At least one American newspaper assumed that was Vincennes, Indiana, not Vincennes, France. So here we have a counter-argument to mapping as knowing, mapping to obscure, transforming certainty into absurdity. Although I must admit, Twain extends the joke and says that readers can stand, if you stand on your head, you can read this properly, or use a mirror. So, at a trite level, Twain's map stands beyond a limit to mapping. We've passed the border of mapping into something else. But what really excited contemporary readers, and frankly me, was the written text, which came with official commendations. General Sherman wrote, for example, "It is but fair to say that in some respects it is a truly remarkable map." Or General Grant, "It is the only map of the kind I ever saw." My favorite, the everyman John Smith, who's writing saying his wife has been afflicted with freckles, one side of this map and she is now cured. She only has the convulsions now. These commendations, they get reprinted in newspapers very quickly. And in fact, I found them being quoted 6-9 months later. I mean, they really, as fast as anything can go viral in the 19th century, these things went viral. And for me, the kicker is this statement right at the beginning. The above map explains itself. A few months later, Mark Twain reproduced the map in The Galaxy, the forerunner of the Atlantic Monthly, where he added more to the commentary, and in particular, comment down here, which said, "Strangers to me keep insisting that this map does not explain itself. One person came to me with bloodshot eyes and a harassed look about him and shook the map in my face, and he said he believed I'm some new kind of idiot." This emphasis on the idea by Twain, on the idea that maps should be self-explanatory, is the crux for me of the overall significance of this work. The emphasis shifts the satire from mocking the map to mocking the common assumptions about what maps are supposed to be. And in this respect, it is the first critique that I've been able to identify of the new ideal of cartography. This ideal is a body of idealizations that developed in a very haphazard manner for all sorts of reasons over the course of the 19th century. The final developments, especially with the rise of personal mobility, post-date this map. So Twain's satire really is quite early and not really effective. The ideal entails a whole series of convictions that define the nature of all maps in our everyday conceptions. That all maps are pictures of the world, made by the same kind of empowered vision that they seem to give readers. That all maps are necessarily about guiding people, that they are for navigation, and that they function independently of any larger technological system in which they're actually embedded. Try using a road map by itself without looking at road signs when you're driving down a highway. You just can't do it. The ideal entails a series of convictions that all maps are the same, that all maps are reductions of the world, regardless of the reasons for which they were made. And that the quality and quantity of that reduction is measured by a single value, the representative fraction, the numerical ratio. We have then a single endeavor of cartography. This is what defines mapping in common parlance. In this respect, all maps appear the same. Whether we're talking about a 17th century world map, a 19th century, early 20th century city plan, cartographic map based on medieval knowledge published in the 15th century, Chinese topographical map from the late 20th century, or a marine chart from the 17th century. All of these works are normalized as depictions of spatial fact. Maps that don't fit the requirements, the ideal, are derided as map-like objects, or cartoids in German. This particular 1930s pictorial map of Ohio that I stumbled across in the vault yesterday calls itself a cartograph. The back formation of cartograph is used fairly extensively today by people who are working with, let's say, Native American maps or statistical diagrams that have a spatial dynamic but are not real maps. So we call them cartographs. Nicolas Cage in National Treasure referred to the map on the back of the Constitution as a cartograph, for example. Now, we can begin to see the ideal at work in the second case study, which details an image that people have assumed many times is the oldest map known in the world. So in central Turkey, on the Konya Plains, is a settlement called old settlement called Hayuk. Here it is, a mound looking eastwards. It was dug in the 60s by James Mellott, and more recently by Ian Hodder, very famous archaeologist. Mellott published his results in a series of articles in Anatolian Studies and a 1967 book. The site, this is after Mellott's excavation, is fascinating. It is all private structures. There are no large spaces for public buildings. There are no roads running through it. It comprises about 18 distinct archaeological layers dating from about 7,500 BCE, so 9,500 years ago, to about 5,500 BCE, 7,500 years ago. At any one time, it had a population of about 5,000 to 7,000 people, so fairly substantial. Here's an artist's impression, which at least gives you the sense of how access to the houses was done. People walked over the rooftops, and then you dropped down through a hatch into individual rooms, houses, storerooms, whatever they are. Okay. Now, here's a plan from the 1964 report for the 63 field season showing one section of one level. And in room 14 of this level, Mellott found, and his team found, a very interesting mural that sort of is on one wall and wraps around the corner a bit. Here's the photograph from Mellott's report. You can sort of see this design on the wall. Now, this is a wall that's been whitewashed repeatedly, so they were taking off the whitewash when they found this thing. And there's a further, you can see all these dots over here. There's another feature. Here it is removed and in the museum under different lighting conditions. And again, you can see the series of these blocks of color. And then there's this sort of feature up here with dots on. Much clearer if you look at it in the modern reconstruction at the museum on site. So there it is, series of these blocks and then this feature up here. Originally, Mellott and his team saw this and he goes, oh, it's just like everything else that we see at this site. This site has many, many, many murals featuring repeated geometric designs. It also has a large number of bullheads, a large number of models of leopards, and a large number of things that sort of look like leopard skins. But later, Mellott and his map maker, Grace Huxtable, went, wait a minute, it's just like our maps. And so in the published 1964 report, and then in the book of 67, they argue that because of the similarity, you only have to compare figure 11, which is their outline of the archaeological dig, with Huxtable's redrawing of the mural, that it's possible that this is a map. What then is the strange double-peaked element at the top? For Mellott, it's just like the mountains. There are a number of twin-peaked volcanic mountains. This is the mountain of Hassan Dor that Mellott thought was the source of the obsidian that you find at the Neolithic settlement of Çatalhöyük for knives and mirrors and things like that. Only one problem. When you actually look at Hassan Dor, when you can see it from Çatalhöyük, it's actually the other way around. And this starts to expose a series of problems with this interpretation. The key here is work by one Stephanie Mies in 2006, again published in Anatolian Studies, who argued that the volcano is all wrong, besides which is not the source of the obsidian. But most importantly, Mies was arguing, why should Neolithic townspeople have made a map in the first place? And there are lots of possible reasons, especially around ritual and religion and so forth. But if they did make a plan of the settlement, why did they make it in such a way that it looks just like a modern archaeological plan? Which, of course, is just the walls with none of the coverings or anything else like that. So by and large, most people have said, yep, it's not a map. Mies's argument is persuasive, not a map. But some people, and this is what intrigues me, some people are arguing it is a map. They insist that it's a map. So another limit to mapping then is overinterpretation. But why people insist on overinterpreting it is another matter. Now, under the ideal, map making is strictly an individual and intellectual activity. It's a cognitive function. And that the map itself, the process of making the map, is externalizing, creating an externalized expression of what's in the cartographer's mind. So we can find very frequently comments like, well, let me just back up. There is this persistent conflation and confusion of basic concepts. The cognitive map, i.e. the spatial schema that we have in our heads, which we call cognitive map, but map there is only a metaphor because we don't actually know, well, neurologists are getting there, but the way that our spatial knowledge is remembered and structured in our minds is not like a map. So you've got cognitive map, then there's sketch map and mental map. Sketch maps are anything you draw. Mental map is when academics bring together a whole bunch of people's conceptions that they've got through asking them to make sketch maps or asking them to explain verbally what they think about spaces, and they then make maps from them. But mental map, in particular, is consistently used, has been for the best part of a century, to equate directly what's in the mind to what's on the paper. So we find statements like, I map, therefore I am, by Catherine Harmon, or the urge to map is a basic, enduring human instinct. To map in terms of to produce a spatial concept in the brain, yes, absolutely. But is the external expression innate to the individual? So, Keith Clark, who is Keith Clark and Danny Dorling, who are both big-name academic cartographers from either side of the Atlantic, both argue that the Neolithic mural, Satahayuk, is indeed a map. And Clark in particular argues that it looks like a map, therefore it is a map. The mural looks like our maps, looks like the site it is. And there's been some public commentary about the volcano. It looks like a volcano, therefore it is a volcano, therefore the whole thing is a map. Clark actively misinterprets Mies to say that Mies is arguing that the people in 8,000 years ago Neolithic town, who are fully cognitively developed Homo sapiens, just like you and I, don't have the capacity to make a map. Mies doesn't argue that at all, but because Clark has this conflation of map making with the cognitive map, then he interprets Mies as saying that. And then he notes, he states right up front, actually, one of his assumptions, proof that Homo sapiens co-evolved with maps as external cognitive aids to navigation and thought is possible, even probably exists. So, implicit in all this is the sense that the structure of the map, I have flipped my slides, sorry. Implicit in this is that the structure of the map is a direct expression of how the individual's cognitive construct is made, which leads to essentializing statements that people X think about space in this way, and only this way. Especially when it comes down to non-Western peoples, and also to a degree Western women. This is an image from a book which has tons and tons of pictures of men doing things with maps while women look on. There's only 2 images in which women are actually agents doing things. One is they're the women who are putting the maps, the National Geographic maps, into the magazines. And this is the other one. And it's a white woman who is interpreting Inuit maps based on a US coast chart or Canadian coastal chart. So the liminal position of the woman in terms of Western mapping is able to interpret this non-Western mapping. Malcolm Lewis, in Volume 1 of the History of Cartography, argued that the topological mapping done by indigenous peoples, prehistoric peoples, indicates that their cognitive development, we're talking about fully grown adults, was at the pre-operational stage of Jean Piaget's scale, which would put them about 2 to 7 years old mental age. And of course, Piaget's scaling of childhood development of Western children is based in part on imperialistic ethnographies of other peoples, especially Papua New Guineans, who seem to be behaving childlike, and so their topological maps are therefore childlike, and you get this incredible conflation of concepts. Western society has been essentialized in its spatial production in the same way. There are a lot of people who have argued that there is only one way in which Westerners think about space. This is, for example, a conception produced by Frederick Jamison and David Harvey as they're trying to talk about postmodern culture as a manifestation of late industrial capitalism, in which they both argue that there is a Western cartography. For Jamison, it develops in the Middle Ages with marine charts. With Jamison, it's with introduction of perspectival vision in the Renaissance. But that this model of rationality ends, when late industrial capitalism changes how we have to act, and they both start talking about living in cities and urban places. Jamison says we have to do this now. Harvey says it happened in the 19th century with the rise of Cubism and stuff. But either way, they're grounded in essentializing arguments based on bad history. So, anyway. The salient point for me is that everybody in our society makes maps in different ways with different spatial conceptions based on different functions that we do. Every one of us, we've been moving through space, walking around New Haven, we think topologically. It's how we think about media spaces through which we're walking. We have other forms of spatial conceptions which we learn from maps, among other things. So, as per Twain, we need to be aware that the ideal of cartography exists, and we need to basically ditch it and break away from it. As I like to say, there's no such thing as cartography. And this is a lecture about it. Don't use the word cartography. It's just idealization. And from the Satterley-Hook analysis, we have to be aware that there's a difference between cognitive schemas that we have in individual minds and then the expressions that we make. And those expressions, that mapping, is a social and semiotic process, necessarily so. So, we can look at this whole array of maps, and we can start saying, well, we've got marine mapping, mapping made by mariners for mariners. If you look carefully, there is very little content inside the lands. All the emphasis is on the oceans. Modern systematic mapping, whether it's topographical, hydrographic, cadastral, what have you, is all geared to state formation, exertion of state control, and so on. Cartographical mapping, regional mapping, is all about creating a sense of regional identity, various times. Urban planning, well, in this case, is actually engineering mapping, is about building things and maintaining the physical infrastructure of our world. And then there's world and cosmographical mapping, all of which are about where are we vis-a-vis the world, vis-a-vis the divine, and how everything fits together. Each of these kinds of maps represents a particular mode of mapping. And we can look at it. I'm now up to 14 modes of different kinds of spatial concepts, different kinds of mapping. The identification of a mode is fairly crude. We can talk about, for example, mappings of place. Mappings that are about defining places, defining the uniqueness of a given place. In this instance, we have fortifications mapping, but we also have the kind of wayfaring guidance mapping, which can be verbal as much as it can be graphic and so on. World and geographical mapping entail a variety of discourses that variously weave the factual with the political. Johann Elip Bode's two hemispheres of the world. The European hemisphere is centered on Berlin, where he's based. You see the same maps made by the French. Oh, look, based on Paris. In London, Britain is based on London, and so on. But they get more fun. Oren's Fine's 16th century quartiform, in which the world is the heart of the cosmos, is the heart of faith. Or we have the overtly political propagandistic mapping, so common in the 20th century, both from the left and from the right. Modes, if you pursue them strongly enough, give way to more precise threads of discourse. You know, the radical world mapping, as opposed to atlas world mapping, as opposed to the world maps you get in educational books, and so on. And you can even, if you're lucky enough, determine particular discourses. In Portland, Maine, up through 1866, when half the city burnt down, there is a very clear local practice of mapping the city for people in the city. So north is actually, you can tell by the north arrow, north is actually up here in the top right corner, but we show the peninsula of the city across the page to maximize the page. Title in the back cove, compass rose, and then the legend, in this case a graphic legend of the buildings, in the Fall River, which is the port. and you've got the South Portland over here, well, then Cape Elizabeth. You see this structure repeated over again through the 19th century when Portlanders are mapping Portland for themselves. But when people from outside, from away, come in, they've got some national engineering training. They think, oh, we need to have standards with north at the top. Then all of a sudden, the peninsula goes diagonal, and you've got lots of extra space to be filled with various things, and so on. So there's a very particular discourse, very well clearly bounded, both in time and in social community. Doing that kind of work takes a lot of work, so it's best to work at the modes to begin with. Then we can drill down a bit. So ultimately, we can say there are a highly diverse variety of processes by which spatial complexity is understood and communicated within a given community. One community can sustain multiple different ways of mapping. I should say spatial complexity is my shorthand, because frankly, if it's not complex, why are people bothering to communicate it, to think about it? Twain's absurdist map is necessarily understood within the dispersed community of newspaper readership in the later 19th century US. And actually, it failed to meet that readership's discursive expectations. The readership really didn't like the map. Many of the commentary, when the commentary gets reprinted over and over again across the eastern United States, it's frequently prefaced by saying, this is far more funny than the map, which might be just an excuse because they can't reproduce the map, but it's the commentary that persists well beyond the Prussians have actually laid siege to Paris, and it's no longer a newsworthy event. For mapping to happen, and this is the limit to mapping, there needs to be a community, a regulated network, which has established semiotic patterns. Within that network, we can have mapping as a construction of spatial complexity. We can have the creation of maps, whatever format they take, whether they are graphic, verbal, physical installations in the landscape, combinations thereof. I should also say there is no such thing as cartographic language. Academic cartographers love to say, it's all about cartographic language. No, it's much more complex semiotic problem of bringing together multiple sets of codes for meaning. Without that social semiotic system, you don't have maps. You only have marks. Thank you. Yay, 20 minutes. Yes.
So I have a question about this Turkish settlement map. I was wondering, can you raise this possibility that the map, this discrepancy between the orientation of the mountain, that this is how the mountain would be seen by someone coming from the other side of the mountain. So it would be kind of a traveler coming in, and from the mountain he would see how this town.
The volcano is a secondary item, at least in terms of the argumentation. You've got to accept that the graphic outline, the graphic pattern, is a map of the town. And then you can start interpreting this shape as a volcano. And a lot of the public commentary, there's been a couple of news reports about it the last couple of years, have stressed the volcano, saying it must be the volcano is real. Hassan Dor did erupt during the lifetime of the settlement, and is a recent discovery and probably close to the making of the mural. Therefore, this mural shows a volcano. But you're still missing that point of semiosis, of interpret, and so what happens is the diagram is interpreted, the mural is interpreted according to our conceptions of what a map should be. not what good archaeological practice is, which is here's a shape, here's a mural, let's interpret it in the context of all the other murals that are on that site. And you do it that way, it's not a map, and that's not a volcano. So, I completely blown off everybody. I can't see because of the light.
Any other questions?
No.
No, if not, I may ask one.
Certainly.
Which is, I mean, I really like the distinction that you were making about the idea of an actual physical map and the separation of that from a cognitive map, and how that is mediated by an understanding of symbols.
Right.
Right. And so, for example, would this mean that we cannot really interpret representations? So, for example, there's a raging debate about cave art.
Right.
Right. So, can we actually interpret something about the cognitive imagination or reality or of the people who made that art and read into that the things that mattered to them were the animals and not the terrain itself,
Right.
for example?
No. I know my archaeological friends would hate me for this. How many of you know what this is? I was trying to find a sunset to slide it in, and I couldn't for the day. It's not on my laptop. This is a local landmark in Bar Harbor, up in Mount Desert Island in Maine, and it's a big moose that sits on top of a restaurant down near the waterfront that illuminates at night. If you don't know that that's the moose, right. So, yeah. Part of the other problem is people, because there's an insistence within the ideal of cartography that maps are material. This is a whole different topic. We don't, under the ideal, we don't really care about how material the map is, or the work of art or whatever. We just know that it exists. And so analysis is therefore split into map production that creates this thing, and then map use then uses this thing. And even the most critical scholars keep this divide, which immediately breaks down, makes it impossible to think in terms of how maps are circulating, how maps are being read, and understanding maps as semiotic systems. So even those academic scholars who study mapping as a semiotic process, they still don't want to think of it as a linguistic process because they think you make the map thing. But if we step back and say that mapping art is both incorporative and inscriptive, to use an older archaeological sense. Incorporative in the sense that meaning is incorporated in acts, in performances, in rituals, as opposed to being inscribed in some way, either on the landscape, in a map or whatever, on a stone, on a piece of paper. If you think of mapping as any semiosis as being either incorporative or inscriptive, then the way that we think about the map completely changes. And we don't have a thing, a single material object. We have a single material object in circulation, being held, being used. I got that slide of people working with a map in the field as opposed to looking at things on the wall, what have you. So, a map. This part of the world, property plans. The legal defining marker of property is not the map, it's not the metes and bounds description in the legal records. It's the monuments placed in the ground that differentiate somehow lines between them. So a property plan, in terms of the map, is just this sketch of a property boundary, maybe some other features. But the key thing is that in actual use, in how people relate to this, both in terms of producing and consuming, what's really important are the marks in the ground, the physical installations, and also the ceremonies that we do around those marks. We've missed it, it's in the spring. There's a Roman holiday called Terminalia, which is the holiday of the god Terminus, who is the god of boundaries. And in Roman tradition, major boundary markers were actually altars to the god Terminus. And so you go around on that day and you perform certain rites at the altars that are the property boundaries between this tribe and the next tribe. Which is sort of no different from every 3 years, the selectmen of every town have to meet up and they go around the town boundaries to make quite sure they are all utterly clear and everyone knows what they are. That's a mapping. Based on memory, based on performance, maybe with a bit of data in the graphic form to help. But unless you know the context and the larger semiotic system, linguistic system if you want, then you can't actually understand what these guys are doing. So cave art, I think you can, if you have enough instances of the art, you can certainly analyze them as figures. That's an oxen, that's a deer, that's an ibis, what have you. But there's this recent thing, right, from a cave in South Africa, a very small shard with ochre lines on it. And they're saying, this is the oldest piece of art. Yes. Well, yes, it's the oldest piece of somewhere some human has scratched lines on a stone, but it's just a teeny little fragment about the size of my thumbnail. How do we know it's art in the way that we think of art? How do we understand this as the guy once was painting his face and just rubbed his fingers on the stone as a way to get rid of the excess ochre so he didn't have ochre-flavored meat when he went to the party? I don't know. I mean, this is the problem with archaeology. You can make up stuff till the cows come home. Bill.
So no surprise, I'm convinced by the sort of the two limits you sketched out here. One is about kind of certain rules of legibility within a community, let's say, within Twain. And the other is about certain assumptions about culture and sort of transcultural ideas about what a normative mind is, with the Turkey example. And I wonder if you could kind of go a little further in the direction that you said you would go to think about how this talk would connect to other kinds of mapping we're going to see later in the year, mapping brain, mapping the genome, etc. Because when I give talks about mapping, I will inevitably have somebody try to enforce the line between what I'm talking about, which is a real map, and these other things that they say are not quite real maps, right? And so there's ways that I know you would answer that by talking about community norms, about the sort of social practices of creating these things, and if they're legible within a certain group, we can talk about them as a mode, let's say. And then you also give us this idea of a spatial complexity. And so the question is, how do you know the limits of something that is spatial? So a social network can be mapped in a certain way that we can understand that as a space, even though there's nothing geographic about it. Similar with genome, the brain, whatever, we can map connections which aren't literally spatial in a three-dimensional sort of world sort of way. So how do we know the limits of space? Is it up to you, Matthew Edney, to decide what a space is or not? How do we determine what is spatial?
Well, I mean, what you're really asking is the boundary between the literal and the metaphorical meanings of mapping. And I think in terms of, well, let me also just back up. there are two reasons why I didn't really want to go into mapping DNA and stuff. One, because I just don't know enough about it. It's one of those topics that like the American Revolution, all my work in colonial America ends in 1765 because I don't want to get involved in the literature around the revolution. It's just too big, it's too complex. So DNA is one of those things in that sense. Secondly, there's always this weird element to me that historians of science don't really get cartography. You're one of the very few who does. And so you read, for Volume 4 of the History of Cartography in the 18th century, we went through various books on the history of science in the 18th century. And there's nary a map in there. There's no hint of cartography. In a few books, few specialized books, you get people talking about mapping and stuff and how it relates to counting and forest management and stuff. But cartography as a whole is treated as being utterly unproblematic. And so you can look at those wonderful books like The Culture of Diagram, where it's all about the concept of diagram. What is a diagram? How do diagrams work? How have people constructed complex diagrams to explain things? And there's not a reference to mapping in there, or maps, cartography, whatever. Somehow diagrams and maps are somehow different. So in terms of this question, in terms of the boundary point between real and metaphorical, which I really have no interest in policing, as far as I'm concerned, if there is a phenomenon that you can treat as having multi-dimensions, because you've got two or three data variables, and so, okay, make one X, make one Y, make one Z. Maybe issues of standardizing your data or whatever. Fine. And then you can start using mapping mapping practices, or the conceptions of mapping, to help you analyze the data. Is that really, am I anyway answering what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I think that thinking about space as dimensionality is useful. I mean, you and I, of course, can talk for hours about this kind of stuff. I, like you, I had no interest in policing that. But because that's what we're kind of here to launch, and it will inevitably come up, I think this idea of dimensionality could be very helpful for thinking about what is...
But then there's also different, so one thing I didn't get into is that different kinds of mapping are supported by different kinds of geometry. So it's not just geometrization. As a lot of people have argued that modern cartography began in the Renaissance with the geometrization of daily life. And but they're not really clear about what they mean by geometrization in practice, in how people actually implemented geometrical concepts in different ways. So your property surveyor who's going out in the land and doing various things with boundaries, treating waters flat, doing distances, directions, in ways that sort of look like Euclidean geometry, but never ever amount to anything as formal or as official as Euclidean geometry. Cosmographers, people interested in the Earth, its relationship to the cosmos, are working with latitude and longitude, which are cosmographical coordinate systems that have then imposed, after Aristotle, onto the Earth, and that don't necessarily, that are specifically for a spherical object. How the flat Earth of the land surveyor and the curved Earth of the cosmos come together really isn't until the mid-18th century, popularized after 1790 in these big statewide surveys that seem to be the basis for the modern ideal of cartography. It creates what I'm calling a projective geometry. It looks like Cartesian, and all sorts of people talk about infinite extensibility of Cartesian space. Yeah, no. Because within the discourse of mapping, we know the world is curved in on itself. It's a closed three-dimensional object. so when we're mapping the Earth, before Charles Saunders Peirce, nobody was really thinking about making maps of infinite space and the X and Y coordinates go off to infinity. It's Peirce who gets into this whole kick about repeating projections and how they can be repeated in all directions to infinity. That then introduces into mathematics this sense of infinite planes that can be applied to maps. And then people then go different directions. I have no idea what I'm saying. I'm waving my hands around up here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much.